The world likes to believe that war is something distant, local, contained, but the data says otherwise. Right now, the number of active conflicts is the highest since World War II. 9 capital cities were struck by state-led air attacks in a single year, from Kyiv to Tehran, from Moscow to Tel Aviv. This is not chaos by accident. It is disorder by design. What's breaking is not just peace agreements. What's breaking is the old assumption that major powers would restrain themselves. That assumption no longer holds. And here is the uncomfortable truth. The United States is no longer just managing global risk. In several theaters, it is part of the equation. If you want to understand why the next 12 months matter more than most people realize, stay with me. Because what looks like scattered crises are actually connected pieces of a single system under stress. If this kind of analysis helps you see the world more clearly, take a moment to engage. Now, let's step back and define what this moment really represents. To understand this moment, we need to be precise about the problem. This is not simply a world with more conflicts. It is a world where conflicts are happening across levels, domestic, regional, and global at the same time. Interstate wars are resurging. Fragile states are collapsing quietly. And great powers are testing boundaries more openly than they have in decades. In 2026, experts judged that nearly every major risk scenario had at least a 50% chance of occurring within a single year. That alone should stop us. But what makes this moment dangerous is not probability, it is accumulation. When violence in Sudan, Gaza, Ukraine, Venezuela, and the Taiwan Strait are all likely, the system loses its margin for error. Policymakers are forced to triage, not resolve. Attention flows toward high-impact crises, while mass atrocities and internal wars fade into the background. This creates a world where instability compounds rather than dissipates. And to see why that happened, we have to look backward at how this global cycle was set in motion. This pattern did not appear overnight. It is the result of a long erosion in how the international system absorbs shock. For years, the burden of global stability rested on a small number of assumptions: that borders would largely hold, that major powers would avoid direct confrontation, and that internal conflicts, even brutal ones, could be contained without destabilizing the system. Those assumptions are now failing. At the same time, as interstate violence resurged, attention shifted upward to conflicts involving major powers and high-impact risks to U.S. interests. That left fragile states exposed. Civil wars marked by atrocities became likely but low impact, not because they are less violent, but because they occur outside the immediate strategic frame. At the same time, great powers began probing the edges: Russia in Ukraine, China around Taiwan, the United States in Venezuela. Each move tests not just rivals, but the limits of restraint itself. When norms weaken, signaling replaces stability. And when signaling becomes the currency of power, escalation becomes easier than de-escalation. That is how isolated risks turn into flashpoints. And one of them is about to show us just how fast this system can ignite. Then came the moment that crystallized this shift. In June, direct conflict erupted between the United States, Iran, and Israel. Not through proxies, not through ambiguity, but through open, precedent-breaking confrontation. 9 capital cities had already been struck by state actors that year. This was different. It confirmed that restraint was no longer the default setting of the system. What mattered was not just the exchange of fire. It was the signal it sent. That escalation between major powers is no longer unthinkable, it is selectable. Once that threshold is crossed, every unresolved rivalry recalibrates its expectations. Russia and Ukraine do not see isolation. China watches Taiwan through a new lens. Regional actors reassess how far they can push before someone pushes back harder. This is how a single crisis multiplies risk elsewhere. not by copying tactics, but by rewriting assumptions. If you find yourself feeling uneasy watching these events unfold, that reaction is rational. Moments like this are inflection points, not headlines, because beneath the visible clashes, something deeper is shifting, a set of mechanisms that quietly determine how violence spreads. And that is what we need to uncover next. Beneath the headlines, the system is being driven by a quieter logic. Experts do not see today's risks as isolated events. They see patterns of behavior repeating across regions, the same incentives, the same blind spots. As military provocations by the United States, China, and Russia become more likely, the system begins to reward action over restraint. Signaling strength becomes safer than appearing passive. Escalation becomes a tool, not a failure. At the same time, U.S. priorities are narrowing. High-impact threats draw attention. Low-impact but highly lethal conflicts are deprioritized. This is why Sudan, judged the most likely scenario to worsen, sits low in strategic urgency, why violence in the Sahel, South Sudan, and Haiti struggles to compete for bandwidth. The system filters risk through interest, not human cost. And here is the paradox. The more attention great power flashpoints receive, the more instability grows elsewhere. Neglect breeds collapse. Collapse creates space for violence. This mechanism does not explode all at once. It degrades stability slowly until a second shock hits. And when it does, the pressure will no longer be abstract. Then the second shock arrives, and it feels closer to home. In 2026, experts flagged one scenario with particular urgency: the expansion of U.S. military operations in the Western Hemisphere. What began as strikes on transnational criminal networks at sea escalated into something more direct. At least 25 U.S. strikes targeted alleged drug smuggling boats. Military presence increased, and speculation grew that the objective was no longer disruption, but destabilization. Venezuela moved from background concern to frontline risk. Not because it suddenly became more violent, but because it became strategically entangled. A local crisis was pulled into great power logic. This matters because when the United States acts close to home, the signal travels far. Russia and China do not see counter-narcotics. They see precedent. Once again, escalation is not copied, it is contextualized. Actions in one region reshape expectations everywhere else. And while attention fixes on capitals and command centers, the real weight of these shifts lands elsewhere, not on policymakers but on people. That is where the consequences become unavoidable. For most people, none of this feels abstract. It feels personal because when systems destabilize, it is not states that absorb the shock. It is you. You feel it when energy prices spike after a distant airstrike, when migration surges because violence made daily life impossible somewhere else, when political tension rises at home, fueled by fear, scarcity, and distrust. Experts warn that growing political violence and unrest inside the United States itself is no longer unthinkable. Domestic stability is now part of the global risk equation. And here is the hardest truth. You don't have to live in a war zone to be affected by war. When policymakers triage crises, ordinary people carry the consequences. Inflation, anxiety, polarization, a constant sense that the world is tightening. If you felt that pressure, if the news feels heavier, sharper, more relentless, you're not imagining it. You are living inside a system under strain. This is why understanding these dynamics matters. Not to scare you, but to prepare you. If this perspective resonates, stay with me. Because the next layer of impact doesn't stop at borders. What happens next does not remain regional. It never does. When multiple conflicts carry a high probability of escalation at the same time, the global system begins to transmit shock faster than it can absorb it. Energy markets react to strikes thousands of miles away. Supply chains reroute, then fracture. Alliances harden, neutrality shrinks. An intensifying war in Ukraine does not stay European. A crisis in the Taiwan Strait is not just Asian. Military moves in Venezuela reshape calculations in Moscow and Beijing. This is how the world becomes more connected and more fragile at once. Each flashpoint increases the cost of miscalculation everywhere else. Each unresolved conflict narrows the space for diplomacy. Experts see this clearly. That is why so many scenarios were judged both likely and high impact. Not because any single war is decisive, but because together they overload the system. And once that happens, power matters more than rules. Speed matters more than consensus. Force becomes easier to choose than patience. Which brings us to the question that actually matters. Where does this trajectory lead? Because from here, the future splits clearly and uncomfortably into three paths. From this point forward, the future no longer unfolds smoothly. It branches. The first path is the contained world. Here, major powers recognize the cost of simultaneous escalation. Conflicts remain intense but bounded. Ukraine drags on. Gaza flares, then pauses. Taiwan stays tense but quiet. This is not peace. It is managed instability. The second path is the fragmented world. Crises erupt unevenly. One miscalculation triggers another. Resources are stretched. Diplomacy lags behind events. Some conflicts cool. Others ignite without coordination, without control. Then there is the third path, the one experts fear most. In this world, multiple high-impact scenarios materialize at once. A major power confrontation intensifies. Regional wars overlap. Domestic unrest deepens. The system loses coherence. What determines which path we take is not ideology or intent. It is capacity, the ability to anticipate risk, to sustain attention, to choose restraint when pressure demands action. That capacity, experts warn, is thinning. Which means the real question is no longer what could happen. It is whether the system can still prevent what it sees coming. And that brings us to the final insight. The final insight is uncomfortable but necessary. The world is not becoming more dangerous because leaders lack information. They see the risks clearly. They ranked them. They warned us. What's eroding is the ability to act early before crises harden into inevitabilities. Experts noted that the United States still has exceptional influence in places where outcomes matter most. Ukraine, the Palestinian territories, the Taiwan Strait, the Korean Peninsula, and in fragile states where peacemaking windows still exist, Sudan, Syria, Haiti, the DRC. But influence only matters if it is used deliberately, not reactively, not selectively, and not after violence becomes the organizing principle. This moment is not about predicting war. It's about recognizing a system under stress and deciding whether to reinforce it or let it fracture further. If you take one thing from this analysis, let it be this. Instability compounds quietly until it doesn't.